Welcome to The Great Awakening. I'm your host, Josh Daws. It's not unusual to hear Christians make arguments against the sexual revolution. That's kind of been a staple of the evangelical movement since the 1960s. But it is unusual to hear those types of critiques coming from a non-religious, even maybe feminist perspective. But that's exactly what my guest today is doing. My guest is Louise Perry. She is a columnist for the New Statesman and a writer for the Daily Mail over in the UK. And she's just written a terrific book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. In that book, she takes a frank look at the sexual revolution and goes through chapter by chapter and really unpacks how the sexual revolution has harmed society, women, and even men. And it's an excellent book. I'm so excited that I got the opportunity to sit down and talk with Louise just before it was released here in the US. I will give you a warning. We do get into some mature subject matter in this episode. So if you typically listen with your kids in the car, you may want to wait until there aren't little ears around. So, but it's a great conversation. I think you'll really find it fascinating. So without any further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Louise. Hey, Louise, thanks for joining me on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello.
Okay, so you've recently written a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution.
Yep.
Which would not be unusual coming from a conservative Christian perspective. Carl Trueman has touched on this in Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is a wonderful book. Nancy Pearcey has written about this in Love Thy Body. Rebecca Merkel has addressed the sexual revolution in Eve in Exile. All wonderful books coming from a conservative Christian perspective. Your book is coming from a non-religious, secular, feminist perspective. Would you call yourself a feminist?
I would, yeah. I mean, I think it's using the quite loose definition of feminism. I think that defining feminism just as anyone who's sort of interested in promoting the interests of women
Yeah.
is a good enough definition for me. So
Yeah. Okay. So what made you begin to look at the sexual revolution with a critical eye that would get you to the point where you'd want to write a book about this?
there wasn't really like one moment. People have asked me that, and I've racked my brains to think if there was some kind of turning point, and there wasn't. I mean, my background, intellectually and otherwise, is brought up in a secular, left-leaning kind of middle-class family in London. I did anthropology at university and women's studies. I worked in rape crisis after leaving university, and at that time would have called myself radical feminist. I still have a lot of friends who are radical feminists. I don't consider myself a radical feminist anymore, and there are some points on which we diverge, but there are points in which we don't. I mean, it's often been observed down the years that conservative Christians and radical feminists have some unexpected points of agreement.
Sure.
On things like porn, prostitution, BDSM, all sorts of things. Not on something like marriage, which we'll probably get onto because I have a chapter on that. But that's kind of my original standpoint. And I've always been interested in violence against women in particular, and that's really what I've spent my whole professional life doing in one way or another, either in frontline services or as a campaigner for legal reform and as a journalist and now as an author. And in a way, I suppose the book is a product of a decade's thinking and work. And I think to some extent is also, I was motivated by the fact that I felt like there are arguments that no one else was making. I mean, as you say, there is a tradition of conservative thinking against the sexual revolution, and there is also a radical feminist lineage here as well that I'm feeding off. But one of the things that I do, which I think is unusual in the book, and I guess original, if not necessarily correct. I hope it's correct. Is I start with some feminist priors and some foundational feminist arguments, but I end up at some conservative conclusions.
Yeah.
And I think it's that journey which is somewhat surprising to a lot of readers.
Yeah. Well, you talk about in the book, you mentioned Chesterton's fence. And for listeners who aren't familiar, it was a way he had of explaining the difference between a progressive reformer and a conservative reformer. The
Hmm.
progressive reformer finds a fence in a field and says, "What's this fence doing here? Let's tear it down." Whereas the conservative would find that fence and, begin to ask questions like, why was this fence built? Let's find out before we start tearing it down. And it struck me as someone who grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor. My mom was a stay-at-home, furthest from what you would think of as a feminist. She stayed at home. She loved being at home, had no aspirations for a career. That's where I'm coming from. And I think so many in the church, Christian world, we know that it's good to be inside the fence, and we know that it's bad to be outside the fence. And sadly, sometimes that's been warped to believe inside the fence are good people and outside the fence are bad people. But a lot of times, I think people in the church forget why the fence is there to begin with. And I think your book is really helpful for, you know, explaining and examining like why some of these traditional things that the sexual revolution threw off were actually there to protect women.
Yeah, the way that it was phrased actually by the partner of a friend who I met at a party recently is he said something like um I found myself saying a lot recently, oh, that's why that tradition exists. Oh, that's
Yeah.
why people, you sort of, I think one of the things that's happened in this period of very, very rapid social change of the last 60 years or so and beyond, I mean, I think that the whole history of our species is very little change. And then suddenly the Industrial Revolution and all of its consequences arrive and people's lives are completely upended. Um, and I think one of the things that we've learned from doing away with certain traditions is what they were there for. What was the point?
Hmm.
Sometimes you can't know until you destroy them. And I think that I'm a historical materialist, right? In the end, if not strictly a Marxist, in that I do think that material conditions precede ideological change, right? And I think
Hmm.
that there are two stories of the sexual revolution. One is the ideological one, which we're probably more familiar with, to do with what radicals of the 60s cook up and the sort of slightly perverse influence they end up having. But the bigger story, I think, is to do with material change and things like the pill and things like um, changes to the economy, which mean that people do very different patterns of work than they have in previous centuries and so on. That really is what explains why things have changed as they have and why it's hard to
Hmm.
go back. Um, it also means that there are certain sort of, to some extent, we do need new ideas to accommodate new material conditions. We can't always be relying on Chesterton's fence. I'm sure Chesterton himself would agree that, he's not saying we don't tear down the fence. He's saying we find out what it's for before we do.
Hmm.
Um, but equally, yeah, I think it has become, it's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? That often when one subscribes to a tradition, whatever it might be, let's say that marriage is a good thing. It's the chapter of my last That's the title of my last chapter, Marriage is Good. Um, it's not necessarily very easy to articulate why it is.
Hmm.
If you're brought up in a culture where it's just considered to be a good thing, then the
Right.
easiest answer is to say, well, it just is. This is my kind of path of least resistance in cultural terms. It's quite hard to unpick why exactly it might be and what the alternatives might look like and so on. Um, which is in a way what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to um, I think a lot of readers coming from all different kind of intellectual and religious traditions, I have Christian readers, I have secular readers, I've got the whole kind of whole age range, men and women, etc. Um, I've people are coming to the book because they have a strong intuitive sense that something is wrong, and that there is a problem with the sexual culture, but not necessarily able to articulate why, except with
Mhm.
recourse to talking about tradition, which secular people and liberal people just can't do. Like that's not available as a sort of explanatory force. Um,
Mhm.
so what I've tried to do is to explain it with lots of data, with um, kind of liberal secular arguments that are as explicable to Guardian readers as anyone else. Um, without any recourse to tradition, religious kind of arguments, trying to kind of explain why those intuitions are there
Yeah.
via those priors, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think your book does a great job of doing it from that perspective.
Thank you.
Um, the sexual revolution, you kind of date it back to the introduction of the pill.
hmm
Why was that such a nuclear bomb on culture?
Because it wasn't previously possible for women to control their fertility, really. I mean, you not in a reliable way. I mean, you can through things like rhythm method and so on. There have always been primitive condoms and things like that available, but the pill is really transformative because women are suddenly able to suspend their fertility in a reliable way. Not quite as reliable as people often think. I mean, the typical use for the contraceptive pill, which remains the most commonly used prescription contraceptive in the US and the UK, is like 91%. So it's not that good, but it's good enough. That's 91% better than nothing. And
Hmm.
uh, it's something that women can take charge of. It's something that's kind of invisible. So you suddenly have, I mean, the way I describe it in the book is you have this entirely new creature entering the world who is a woman who looks fertile, but actually isn't because she's sort of artificially suspended her fertility. Um, and
Hmm.
in all of our species history, that was an entirely new phenomenon. And so all of the complex um, social structures built up basically to try and stop young men and young women from being alone together and producing children who would be the community's problem. Suddenly those
Hmm.
structures no longer seem to be necessary, and they degrade very, very quickly after the pill's
Yeah.
introduction, and accompanied, of course, by all of the kind of ideological change of the 60s and beyond, which has really stuck in a way that radical.
Right.
I mean, there have always been, radical thinkers and sexual adventurers and so on down the years. Um, and some people will point to these isolated examples, often aristocrats, people who have unusual kind of. The example I give in the book is
Hmm.
the Bloomsburys, like Virginia Woolf and so on, who had all sorts of kind of unusual sexual relationships and so on. But that was always a weird thing. It was always an outsider thing to do. Whereas I think what the sexual revolution of the 1960s did, which was so strange, is it made that weird behavior normal to the point where
Hmm.
now actually it's almost invisible just how strange our sexual culture is compared with that of centuries past.
Yeah. Well, and so often too, the consequences of those changes are felt much more dramatically with the poor, lower class people who, embrace those ideas that are being, pushed by their aristocracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you familiar with Rob Henderson's idea of luxury beliefs?
I'm not sure.
So he's an American writer and psychologist, although he's actually based in the UK now. And he came up, I don't know, 5 years ago with this idea of luxury beliefs. So a luxury belief
Okay.
is a belief that grants status to the upper class people at the expense of lower class people.
Mm.
So there are lots of examples, but one of the examples he gives in his original essay is polyamory, right? If you are wealthy elite person who's experimenting with polyamory in New York, London, wherever, um, it grants status on you because it makes you seem bohemian and exciting, and the
Hmm.
consequences when it goes wrong for you are easy to ameliorate with money and status. People aren't going to judge you nearly
Hmm.
as much for for being a single mother. You have all sorts of resources available to you to cushion the blow if a novel relationship structure collapses, which it almost invariably will. Whereas if you
Hmm.
are, living in a trailer and having multiple children by multiple men, there's absolutely no status conveyed on you, and actually it will send your life into complete disarray.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a belief that that harms poor people and helps rich people, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah.
Once you
I
hear
think
about it, you
Charles
see them
Murray
everywhere.
has,
Yeah. I'm sure Charles Murray has
yeah.
also
Uh,
read Rob's work.
yeah. Um, one thing you mentioned in the book is that often the remedy to some of these social ills that happen and this kind of, as women and men both are kind of washed into the rocks of this sexual revolution, the answer is, well, you just need more of it.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? How I liked how you said the freedom lever just keeps getting hit,
That's it.
more and
It's
more.
quite a common response that I've had from progressives, because I think it is almost universally recognized now that our sexual culture isn't very good, particularly for
Mhm.
women, and that things like the porn industry is rather ugly, and that there are clearly a lot of unhappy people, washing about in this new, apparently liberated culture. Um, but the most common response from progressives who are still really wedded to the sexual liberation project is to say, well, this is because we haven't implemented it properly. We haven't fully liberated ourselves. The original concepts were great. They just haven't actually been realized, which does sound, if anyone, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the true communism has never been tried. Defense of
Sure.
communism, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, my argument, and where I radically depart from um, progressives, is that I don't think that the original principles were good. I think that the original principles were always doomed to failure. Um, and I think that what we're seeing now, in terms of the negative outcomes of the sexual revolution, is an inevitable consequence of the fact that you've basically thrown freedom at a society that is inherently riven by sexual asymmetry, and moreover is in
Mhm.
denial about the fact that it's riven by sexual asymmetry. And I think in that context, freedom is not going to improve anything. It's actually going to make that sexual asymmetry worse, or the effects of it. I mean, it's an
Yeah.
inevitable fact of life. It's going to make the effects of sexual asymmetry much more destructive than they might otherwise be.
So by sexual asymmetry, that just the plain fact that men and women are
Yeah,
different.
physically and psychologically.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's pretty controversial for
I know.
our culture today,
Yes.
um, in so many
Yes.
ways. Um, so those, what would you say are like kind of the foundational ideas behind the sexual revolution?
um, So I'd say that the first one is that differences between the sexes are trivial and easily overcome, and actually that we must overcome them. That I mean, it's even become in much more recent years, it has even become controversial to state that women are the ones who get pregnant, um, and men aren't.
Mm.
Something as basic as that kind of biological fact is now apparently up for negotiation, and we're talking about menstruators and gestational parents and all this kind
Birthing
of
people.
nonsense. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's like the full iteration of this worldview. I would say is the logical conclusion actually of thinking that has been developed since the 60s. Um,
Hmm.
First around minimizing the psychological differences between the sexes, then minimizing the physical differences. It's not uncommon to read or hear um, feminists or other progressives saying, for instance, that strength differences between men and women are a result of socialization, or are hugely exaggerated by socialization. There's this famous essay called "Throwing Like a Girl," um, which a feminist philosophy essay, which is very influential, which basically argues that a significant factor in the fact that women can't throw as far as men can is because we're sort of socialized to physically restrict ourselves.
Mhm.
There probably is some truth in that, but also men's upper body strength. I mean, men can punch twice as hard as women can punch. Men can bench press twice as much as women can bench press. I mean, anyone who's stepped foot in a weightlifting gym will know that the differences in upper body strength between the sexes are immense and
Mhm.
are very difficult to, even the very strongest women will sometimes be physically overpowered by men who've not trained at all. Even elderly men. Like,
Mhm.
it's amazing how big the differences are. But that effort to minimize those physical differences, I think, has kind of logically concluded with the trans movement's effort to obliterate the differences between the sexes, full stop, and basically just see us as kind of
Mhm.
amorphous gender goo, and
Right.
um, I think in that context, it becomes a lot easier to adopt the ideas of the sexual revolution to do with, women should be having sex like men. Um, there's nothing inherently dangerous about. I mean, it's a weird kind of contradiction because on the one hand, obviously, post Me Too and also before, even liberal feminism is very anxious about sexual violence, and it's a very, very important sort of plank of the movement trying to ameliorate sexual violence. Um, but you also get strange suggestions, like one I write about in the book. A woman who writes into a liberal feminist agony aunt column and says, I'm really interested in exploring BDSM. Sort of, what do I do? And the advice columnist says, oh, you should go on the internet and just say that you'd really like to be strangled by someone, and just find a man from the internet and go back to his house, and off you go. And if anything bad comes from that, then that's just a
Wow.
consequence of that's his problem, basically, because he's not respecting your consent. You have the right to explore your sexuality in full freedom, which is a weird contradiction. On the one hand, we're very, very worried about violence against women, rightly so. And also on the other, encouraging women to do wildly dangerous things. But I guess it comes down in the end to the idea that, freedom is our goal. You should be free in every possible way, behaviorally, physically, whatever. And the project is sort of to fake it till you make it, pretend as if we're all
Mhm.
free, and then
Yeah.
it will become so. And that I think ends up with these kind of crazy convoluted language games as well, because it's all about maintaining the pretense, in the hope that
Yeah.
reality will catch up eventually. Um, so
Right.
there's the physical, the triviality of differences between the sexes is one important idea. Another idea is what I call sexual disenchantment. I've borrowed that idea from American writer called Aaron Sparian, who wrote a really fabulous essay on cuties. Do you remember that dreadful Netflix?
Mhm.
Yeah, Aaron wrote a
Yeah.
very good essay on it, and he coined this term sexual disenchantment, which he's borrowed from Max Weber, um, which is basically the idea that sex used to have a special status, a sacred status. I think every religious tradition in the world has some kind of sacredness attached to sex in one form or another,
Mhm.
and special rules governing who you can have sex with and when and so on. Um, but the sexual disenchantment idea, which I think is really just a rhetorical idea. I don't think there's anyone who actually lives as if sexual disenchantment was true, because people don't behave as if they don't behave as if they actually believe it. But it has a lot of
Mhm.
rhetorical force, in a kind of um, in a morally relativist kind of political environment. And it says that, well, we used to have this silly old-fashioned idea that sex had some special meaning, but actually it needn't. If people want to invest meaning in their sexual relationships, they're welcome to, but they don't have to. It can be considered
Mhm.
as just completely morally neutral act, like shaking someone's hand or making coffee, or um, any other kind of social interaction you can imagine. The only thing that matters is consent. There shouldn't be any other. It should be understood in a kind of sterile, legal, contractual way. As long as you've signed on the dotted line, and metaphorically, and the consent is there, then there's no problem.
Mhm.
Um, the problem is, as I say, that no one actually behaves as if that's true. Even people who, for instance, are
Hmm.
trying to live so-called ethical non-monogamy, kind of polyamory, um, where they have relationships with other people with their partner's consent. Um, Speak to anyone involved in polyamory or go onto any platform online of people discussing it, and you'll find people who are really struggling with jealousy in a way that you do not find.
Hmm.
We do not feel terribly jealous when our partners shake someone else's hand, right, or make someone else coffee, because there is a recognition there that actually sex isn't the
Right.
same as those other things. We have a kind of visceral reaction to it, which we don't have to other things, and which can't actually be rationalized away even if you try. So that
Hmm.
people do try, to understand sex as being um, disenchanted, and it tends to cause them harm, you know, down the line. Either
Yeah.
because the consequences of that view are, I think, harmful on a social level, but also because actually it produces a very painful cognitive dissonance often, where people are
Yeah.
trying to behave as if this means nothing, but actually their bodies are telling them otherwise. And I think particularly that's true for women.
Yeah. British Bridget Fettisy's recent
Yeah.
article.
Yes.
Um, I, it's something
I
I
regret being a
regret being a
slut. Yeah,
slut.
yeah, which she wrote because,
Yeah.
well, she started
Oh.
writing it before we spoke
Hmm.
and before she'd wrote my book. But it was my book that prompted her to finish it. It's an amazing essay.
Yeah, it's so good. It's just gut wrenching, and I just think, you talk about in the book the limits, how bad a kind of hurdle
Hmm.
consent is. Like it is not. Um, consent can be coerced and manipulated, and I lived in Los Angeles for about 8 years, and in the whole film world, and just saw just the things that people will consent to do because they think it will give them their career, but it's okay because got it
Yeah.
signed on the line. There's a contract, and in a lot of ways, we've moved the casting couch in front of the camera and think that somehow cleans it
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's
It's a lot of space between something being consensual and something being good. Yeah.
mhm. Yeah. You talk about that too. That there are bad
Yeah.
desires, and that this every society is going to have something that's taboo, and when you begin the project of erasing taboos, there are no limiting factors. Another thing you touched on in your book is um, just the effects that porn culture is having on um, the society at large, and particularly the young, I guess, generation Gen Z. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing
Hmm.
there?
So interestingly, I think Gen Z is starting to turn against porn um, in a way that I hadn't quite appreciated before writing and publicizing this book. Um, I mean, it kind of goes in both directions, I think, with Gen Z. To some extent, I think there is a bit of a sexual counter revolution happening, which a lot of people have mentioned to me and asked me about. And it's definitely the case that if you go onto TikTok, Twitter, wherever you like, um, you will come across lots of young women and young men reacting against um, the principles of sexual revolution. Um, Similarly, you will also see lots of them who are really, really um, um, kind of paid up subscribers to this sex positive ideology as well. So I
Hmm.
think it bifurcates to some extent. Um, there is definitely a reaction against porn coming from that generation, from both boys and girls. I mean, the boys, it tends not to be motivated so much by sort of feminist principles, but more by the fact that porn clearly has a very
Hmm.
destructive effect on users, particularly regular users. And there are some men, mostly but not exclusively, who end up having a very compulsive relationship with it, using it a lot. Rates of erectile dysfunction have gone up to an astonishing degree within the last 20 years when online porn entered the world. And and typically the case that any man who's using porn very regularly is not going to have a healthy and happy sex life. It's going to limit his real life relationships um, in all sorts of ways. So that's the motivation behind things like NoFap, which is an online sort of porn abstinence community, which doesn't have it's not religious, although there are religious elements within it. And I would say that actually it probably is kind of, even if it's not explicitly religious, I think there are some sort of Christian principles within it, which
Right.
aren't necessarily described as such. And similarly, I think girls are reacting against hookup culture in particular, and the feeling that they've been used by sexual partners, which I think is accurate, to be honest. I mean, if you survey young women and ask them how they feel about casual sex, they'll often say that they feel like they suspect that they've been used for sex by men who don't really care about them. And then you ask young men and they say, yeah, I use women for sex I don't really care about. So that they're not wrong. That is often what's going on, and they are growing tired of it. Many of them, and you've got, I mean, that's expressed in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think it's very likely, for instance, that the huge spike in young women transitioning, either identifying as men or identifying as non-binary or whatever. I mean, with or without medical interventions. Some of them don't pursue medical interventions, right? But just identify differently, or identify as asexual, or any of these other kind of things under the LGBT umbrella. I think it used to be the case that more male people pursued transition than female people, and that's reversed hugely. It's now overwhelmingly a young female thing, it's a teenage girl thing, and I think that makes complete sense within a culture which is so suffused by porn, and where many young women feel really quite frightened of sexual relationships, and frightened by porn, and just kind of want to just opt out. And one means of opting out is to just opt out of being a woman. So I don't think it's a surprise that many of them are doing that.
Yeah, I saw.
So yeah, I mean,
I saw
go
someone
ahead.
explaining why they identified as asexual, and they were saying that, well, I looked at porn and I knew I didn't have that desire for what I was seeing on there, so I must be asexual. I'm like, well, that just means you're normal, you know?
Yeah. The other term that kind of makes me laugh, although it is sad as well in its ways, demisexual, which is used normally to mean like you only want to have sexual relationships with people that you're emotionally attached to, and you get young women walking around calling themselves demisexuals, like you just have typical female sexuality. But the problem is that they've been brought up to think that actually the normal and good thing is to want to have sex like a man, is to do the kind of Sex in the City thing. So of course, to their mind, they think, well, if I don't want that, then I guess I must be strange. And there is status to some extent in having a kind of special identity label. So you can see why why they've adopted it, even if it's
you talk about the different. I'm probably not gonna get the term right. This sociosexual desire bell curves between men and women, and how we've asked women to meet the man's sexual appetite. I found that really interesting, and especially in comparison to what Christianity brought in the first century, where it essentially asked men to, restrain themselves.
Yeah.
Do you see any hope of
Yeah.
I know a lot of I think the anti-porn movement and things are hopeful, but do you see any kind of movement to get men to be more restrained?
I mean, the early Christians managed it, didn't they? I mean, I'm by no means expert in that era, so I don't know what sort of factors led into the success of Christian sexual ethics, but it was a very remarkable thing to do, to say that actually, no, men should be adopting chastity, not just women. That was a very, very radical thing to say in the Roman world. And yeah, I think to some extent, what we're seeing is a kind of a slip back towards a more Roman way of doing things, right? In terms of thinking that actually the unrestrained sexual behavior of high status men is just a fact of life. Is one of the things that first set me thinking along these lines was reading Tom Holland's
great
book
book.
Dominion. Where he writes about this kind of strange fact that on the one hand, the Me Too movement, using things like the handmaid's outfits, and is very kind of explicitly set up in opposition to Christianity. But then actually, the very idea that Harvey Weinstein shouldn't have sexual access to his social inferiors, that's a very Christian idea. That's not a universal idea. That no one would have blinked twice at him behaving in that manner in the Roman world. So there's an interesting kind of slightly unspoken tension between Christianity and feminism on that front. Feminism, I'd say, is born out of Christianity in many ways, but also rejects it. Particularly in America, this is a very kind of binary way of viewing it. I mean, the sociosexuality gap is a problem, right? So sociosexuality is what is a term psychologists use to describe your desire for sexual variety, how much you want to have casual sex, how quickly you want to have sex with someone after you've met them, things like that, how interested you are in things like porn and prostitution. And I think anyone should be surprised to hear that men on average are higher in sociosexuality than women are, particularly when they're young. It's something that varies across your life cycle. Men in their teens or 20s are obviously more driven by a desire for sexual variety than other points in their lives, and more so than women, with exceptions. We're talking about two bell curves that overlap. So you're going to have men and women at every point along. And just because you know someone's sex doesn't necessarily mean that you know their sort of, I mean, you can kind of understand its sexual orientation in the sense that it just seems to be largely innate. And the problem with the sociosexuality gap for straight people is that there's a mismatch. So men want casual sex more than women do, but they obviously rely on women in order to have it. And one solution, as if you want to put it that way, to the sociosexuality gap is prostitution, which is what the Roman world depended on, right? Having a slave society with mass access to the bodies of prostituted slave women. That is a way of guarding the chastity of high status women while still allowing men to have as much casual sex as they want. I think that's a monstrous solution to the sociosexuality gap, right? The post-1960s solution has been essentially to encourage women to match male sexuality, all women, not just women in prostitution, and a kind of shifting of the female bell curve up towards the male curve. The problem that you have with that is what we're seeing. You have a lot of women who are basically having consensual in a legal sense, but also not really wanted sexual encounters that leave them feeling really wretched. And often they don't actually have the vocabulary to describe why they're feeling wretched, because it's supposed to be desirable. It's supposed to be, what you're supposed to do. And the idea that there are these innate differences between men and women is almost impossible to articulate if you come from particular progressive circles. And so you end up with women who are feeling really terrible, but they don't really know why. And that, I think, is also a bad solution to the sociosexuality gap. So what I'm saying, and I would say this is a fundamentally feminist claim, is that actually women or anyone having unwanted sex is terrible, whereas sexual frustration is regrettable but not as bad. So the solution should be for the male sociosexuality bell curve to be kind of brought to meet the female.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw you on the trigonometry show with those guys, and I sent that to a friend of mine who's a conservative Christian feminist. So she would call herself a feminist, and I said, if the next wave of feminism comes back around to Christian sexual ethics, so sign me up. I'm all in. But you talk about the conclusion of your book. You talk about, I think it's called "Listen to Your Mothers." Can you talk about the importance of of motherhood and how sexual revolution has diminished that and changed how we perceive that important role?
I think there's a really fundamental misalignment between motherhood and liberalism, because if liberalism, one, the unit of analysis is the individual, it which is very difficult to reconcile with the fact that mothers aren't really individuals, because you are so even after birth, you are so tightly bound emotionally and also physically to your baby. um, you don't, I say this as a mother of a toddler, I mean, even in an era when you have formula and you have um, all the various, surrogacy, all these various kind of technologies, which would seem to suggest that actually the link between mother and child is optional. That's not how we're evolved to feel. The intense bond that you feel with your baby is, it's like the feeling that sex is meaningful in a way that shaking hands isn't. There is there's like a visceral sense that you really can't remove, even if you try very, very hard. And if you do try, it will hurt you. So many women will talk about, I was just speaking to Bridget Vettersy actually, because she's had a baby recently, that feeling when you first start being apart from your child for short periods, and it feels like you're missing a limb. You're constantly thinking about them. That, like, the bond is insane. And so to say, oh, okay, well, what we've got here is we've got two individuals, a mother and a baby, is absurd. Babies aren't individuals. They can't survive without the devoted care of other people. And the problem with viewing, so one, liberalism takes the individual as its unit of analysis and struggles to reconcile the fact that actually people are bonded to each other in all sorts of complex and sometimes invisible ways. It also can't, if your political goal is freedom above all else, motherhood and indeed fatherhood and indeed any relationship with another person is really incompatible with that, because it necessitates limiting your freedom in ways that you can't choose. I mean, you maybe choose at the point where you conceive or assume legal responsibility for a child. But I don't get to if my son's crying at 1 o'clock in the morning, I don't get to say, sorry, mate, my freedom is, you're impinging on my freedom. Like, I am compelled in every possible way to go to him. And how do you deal with that? I mean, the way that liberal feminism has, and indeed radical feminism, I mean, most forms of feminism until now, with some notable exceptions, the way that feminism has dealt with that is just to reject motherhood, to say, well, it limits women, excuse me, it limits women's freedom in an unacceptable way, and so it has to go. Whereas I guess what I've kind of said is, okay, if feminism and liberalism are incompatible, then I guess it's liberalism that's got to go.
Yeah, that's it's I think New York Times this week was trying to push the idea that
that maternal bond
that
thing,
the maternal instinct was not real, and which
yeah. What was really interesting about it, as my my friend Mary Harrington, who's a contributing editor at Unheard, she wrote a piece about that New York Times piece today, which is really worth reading. And she pointed out that on the one hand, what they say is that the maternal bond is a social construct, and that actually anyone really can fill that place if they want to. The argument seeming to be that, if we say that the gestational parent, the person who's given birth to this child, has to be bonded to that child in important ways, then it means that if adoptive couples, for instance, are necessarily excluded from that in a way that may be painful to them. And so the motivation is basically to be more inclusive by denying the fact of the mother baby dyad. But then also equally ends up in the article arguing that for maternity leave and for all this kind of provision, which is shockingly absent in America, which I completely agree with. But you can't simultaneously say that mothers don't have any kind of unique status, and also say that mothers are uniquely deserving of certain accommodations. Like,
Right.
sorry, either we're all fungible units, or we're not.
Yeah.
I don't think we are
Right.
fungible units, which is why I think that we should have pro-family, pro-mother policies.
Right. Yeah.
But I think the New York Times are confused about that.
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned Eve in Exile by Rebecca Merkel earlier. She writes in that about the reason why men used to be paid more than women. Is it because it was recognized that there is more often than not a wife and mother at home, doing important work, taking care of the family. And so it wasn't, a way of thumbing it to career women. It was more often a way of compensating for that work that we've lost in this new world, that we don't acknowledge that work anymore.
British socialists call it the family wage. I don't know if that's an American phrase as well, but the idea that men should be paid a family wage that could support a whole family on one income, which is now pretty much a thing of the
It's so
past,
hard.
really, for everyone except the upper classes. Yeah. I mean, the problem, of course, with this, and this is just true of any area of life, really, and it's a fundamentally conservative insight, really, is that everything has trade-offs. So if you have a system designed for the single male breadwinner, there are absolutely advantages to that in terms of that division of labor makes sense, and for many, if not most families, is the most effective way of running a household. There will be casualties from that, inevitably. Anyone who doesn't conform to that model, and I think that recent, as the New York Times are attempts to be inclusive, attempts to scoop up those casualties and find some other way of running things, are well intentioned, but very often fail in ways that actually make everyone worse off. I mean, we're coming back to Chesterton Spence again.
Yeah. And it's, it ends up by opening up more opportunities for women. You're narrowing the opportunities for women who don't fit that model, who may want to stay home but just can't. It's all about trade-offs, like you said.
Yeah.
Well, before we go, I want to ask you final question that I've been asking my guests. There's a lot of black pills in the world that we can, my wife told me, your podcast is really heavy. Can you end maybe on a lighter note? So what is giving you hope right now?
I just wrote an article actually for The Spectator, which was unusually cheerful for me as well. I also a bit addicted to the black pill, on fathers being more involved in their children's lives in this country, and I would imagine elsewhere in the West as well. There is quite a strong trend towards fathers spending more time with their children. Those fathers who are at home, because obviously we've got single motherhood as well to contend with, but those fathers who are at home, being much more involved in their children's lives, spending much more time with them, including post-pandemic, because lots of people actually spent less time out of the house because of lockdown and decided they actually really liked their kids and they wanted to carry on spending time with them. So that's a very that's an unusually pleasant trend.
That's great.
In all the data on families and relationships.
I attribute some of that to Bluey. Have you watched Bluey with your you have a boy or a girl?
Not yet. Not a boy, but we've not yet really delved into children's TV. Although we did watch 101 Dalmatians with him, the Disney film, the other day, and he one of his favorite words at the moment is "gee," meaning doggy. Nice. And so every time a doggy came on the screen, he let us know.
Yeah, well, Bluey's great. It's it's got that, mom and dad, they're just so involved in their kid's life and so fun, and it's so encouraging to me that shows like that are, causing people, parents to want to be more involved with their kids too. So, that's nice. Well, thank you, Louise. Your book is one of the things that is giving me hope. I hope it finds wild success as it was just released here in America. I think all my listeners should go out and buy a copy and support Louise and the work she's doing. And where can people find you?
So I wrote regularly for the Daily Mail here in the UK, and I'm on Twitter at Louise_M_Perry, and yeah, The Case Against Sexual Revolution is out on 6th of September
Awesome. Well,
in the US.
thank you so much, Louise. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much, and you. Bye bye.
That's our show for today. Big thanks to Louise Perry for joining me for this conversation. I highly encourage you to pick up her book. It's a really wonderful book. You can find links to where you can purchase that in the show notes, as well as link to her Twitter and some of her other writing. I really hope and pray that this book is signaling a pendulum swing in society back towards Christian sexual ethics. What I've found is that as people are really rethinking a lot of the assumptions that we've had about liberalism or sexual revolution, that there's also seems to be an openness to the gospel. And I think that this is a time that we should really be leaning into these conversations, not shying away from it, worried we're going to offend, but really, embrace this time of cultural change we're going through, because that is a time where people are more open to those types of conversations. So highly encourage you to do that. If you enjoyed this, please share it with a friend. If you're listening on the podcast, ratings and reviews at Apple Podcasts are really helpful. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit like and subscribe so you don't miss future content. And until next time, fight the good fight. We'll see you soon.